Let me tell you about the worst morning of Rebecca Riley's life, which also happened to be, though she couldn't know it yet, the best. She was at the altar. She was in the dress. She had done absolutely everything right. And then her betrothed kissed her sister, in front of everyone, at the altar. Her sister. I know. Here's where it gets interesting. The morning Rebecca Riley was meant to save her family, she instead became the lesson they never meant to teach. Where the sky over London was the color of old ivory, the same shade as her gown, her gloves, and the future everyone had already decided for her. She stood in the vestry of St. Bartholomew's Cathedral, her mother adjusting the veil for the fourth time with fingers that trembled not from emotion, but from desperation. Down the corridor, the congregation had already filled every pew. She could feel them through the stone walls. London's most watchful eyes, silk-draped and sharp-tongued, had assembled not to celebrate a wedding, but to observe a transaction. Rebecca was 24 years old, and she had already been valued, priced, and sold. In the world she inhabited, a woman without a husband was a sentence without an ending. She was grammatically incorrect, a liability dressed in lace. Her father had been dead for 2 winters, and with him had gone every comfortable fiction the Riley family had maintained about their place in respectable society. And there were debts behind closed doors, brothers whose education hung by a thread, a mother whose dignity had curdled slowly into something that looked, up close, more like fear. The solution was Edward Coleman. Not a love story, a ledger entry. Rebecca had watched the arrangement unfold with the detachment of a student studying a theorem she found morally questionable but mathematically inevitable. Edward was steady. Edward was solvent. And Edward would restore their name to the kind of dinner party lists that mattered to her mother, and in exchange, Rebecca would be decorative, obedient, and grateful. She had rehearsed grateful. She was very good at it by now. What she had not rehearsed was her sister. Valerie stood among the bridesmaids, golden, effortless, adored in the particular way that beautiful women are adored when they have never had to earn anything. Rebecca had spent years quietly managing the consequences of Valerie's impulsiveness. The torn reputations, the borrowed money returned late, the scenes that required older sisters to smooth over with apologies and grace. She had never thought to manage this. The ceremony began precisely as it was meant to. The organ, the murmurs settling to silence. The clergyman's practiced solemnity. Rebecca walked toward the altar with her bouquet held like a shield, and her expression arranged into something serene. She was almost convincing. And then the room changed. Not loudly, not all at once, but in the particular way that disasters announce themselves. A ripple, a gasp, a collective reorientation of 100 faces toward something that should not be happening. Rebecca turned. Edward was no longer beside her. He was facing Valerie, and in the 3 seconds that followed, 3 seconds that would be discussed in drawing rooms for the rest of the season, he kissed her. The bouquet hit the stone floor. Rebecca heard it as though from a great distance, the soft, final sound of white roses meeting cold ground. Around her, the congregation exhaled as one. Not a scream. Worse than a scream. The sound of an entire room deciding, in unison, that she was ruined. She did not faint. She had been raised not to faint. As she stood at the altar of St. Bartholomew's Cathedral, alone in her altered gown, her gloved hands empty, her entire future rewritten in the space of a kiss. And she felt, beneath the shock, beneath the humiliation, beneath the terrible clarity of what this would cost her family, something she had not expected. She felt herself go very, very still, in the way a woman goes still when she has just understood that the life she was prepared for and the life she was actually living are 2 entirely different stories, and that she is, for the first time, completely without a script. She turned to leave. She had taken exactly 3 steps toward the cathedral doors when a voice stopped her, cold, low, unhurried, carrying across the silence with the ease of a man accustomed to being heard. "Miss Riley." She looked up, and at the far end of the aisle stood a man she had not expected to see at this wedding, had not expected to see anywhere, frankly, given that the Duke of Beaumont was famously, almost philosophically, opposed to social obligation. He was dressed entirely in black. He was watching her with an expression that was not pity, not amusement, not the careful blankness of embarrassed witnesses who had already begun composing their accounts for later. It was something she could not immediately name, and it looked, impossibly, like recognition. She had perhaps 30 seconds before the whispers collapsed into chaos. 30 seconds before her mother fainted, before Edward began his justifications, before London made its final judgment and sealed her fate behind a locked door of gossip and exclusion. The Duke of Beaumont took 1 step forward, and everything Rebecca Riley thought she understood about value, choice, and in the machinery of her world was about to be dismantled, beginning with the morning she had already lost everything and was about to, improbably, begin. She had walked into St. Bartholomew's Cathedral as an investment. She would leave it as something rarer and far more dangerous. A woman who had been chosen, not purchased. But to understand why the Duke of Beaumont stepped forward on that frozen morning in front of London's most unforgiving witnesses, you need to understand what brought Rebecca Riley to that altar in the first place. And that story begins not with church bells, but with debt. St. Bartholomew's Cathedral was not, on that morning, a house of God. It was a courtroom. The pews were the gallery, the altar was the dock, and London's finest, draped in silk, armed with lorgnettes and long memories, were the jury. They had not come to witness a marriage. They had come to observe a verdict. In high society, and a wedding was never truly about the couple. It was about the family, the alliance, the quiet, collective confirmation that the social order remained intact, and everyone was still in their correct place. Rebecca had understood this walking in. What she had not understood was that the verdict had already been written. She noticed Edward's distance first, the way a body notices cold before the mind names it. That his hand in hers during the processional had been technically present and emotionally absent. No squeeze of reassurance. No glance that said, "We are doing this together." He stared forward with the fixed expression of a man watching a door he was deciding whether to walk through. She told herself it was nerves. She had been telling herself that for 3 weeks. Valerie stood among the bridesmaids to the left. And Rebecca had caught it twice. A flicker of something passing between her sister and Edward. Not a look, exactly. More like the memory of one. The kind of glance 2 people exchange when they are performing indifference and failing at the edges. Rebecca had filed it away. There were things a woman in her position could not afford to examine too closely before the ceremony was complete. She had been wrong to wait. It happened slowly. That was the part no one who retold it ever got right. And they always described it as sudden. A shock, a moment, a scandal that erupted. But it wasn't. It unfolded the way a structure fails, one quiet fracture, then another, then the collapse that looks, from the outside, instant. Edward turned. Not toward the clergyman. Toward Valerie. 2 steps. That was all it took to dismantle everything. He crossed the space between duty and desire in 2 steps, raised his hand to Valerie's face with a tenderness he had never once directed at Rebecca, and kissed her. Slowly, deliberately, in front of God and every person who mattered in London. The bouquet left Rebecca's hands before she decided to drop it. White roses, her mother's careful choice, scattered across cold stone. And in that sound, that soft, final impact, something shifted in the room. She felt it before she saw it. The congregation exhaled. Chairs scraped, bodies turned. Away from her. This was how it worked. This was always how it worked. and a woman's reputation was not hers to lose. It could be taken in public by someone else's choice, and the crowd would hold her responsible for the spectacle regardless. Shame in that world was not assigned to those who caused it. It attached itself to whoever was left standing in it. Rebecca was standing in it. She did not faint. She had been raised not to, but she felt the full weight of 100 pairs of eyes completing their assessment, and finding her, without a word spoken, the guilty of the only crime high society never forgave: being abandoned. Rebecca had always been good at analysis. It was the quality her tutors had praised and her mother had quietly discouraged. This habit of standing outside a situation and examining it with clinical precision, as though emotion were a variable that could be isolated and set aside. It had made her an excellent student. It had made her, her mother frequently noted, a difficult daughter. She used it now. Standing at the altar of St. Bartholomew's Cathedral, bouquet on the floor, congregation still buzzing with the particular energy of witnessed catastrophe, Rebecca Riley catalogued her situation the way a physician catalogues a wound, efficiently, without flinching. The consequences arrived in order of severity. First, no second proposal. In London's marriage economy, a woman abandoned at the altar was not sympathetic. She was suspicious. Men did not rescue fallen reputations, but they avoided them the way they avoided bad investments and dinner parties with dull wine. She would not be pitied. She would be declined. Second, the family. Her brother's school fees, her mother's creditors, the careful fiction of Riley respectability, all of it now attached to today's date like a debt notice. The name that was meant to be restored had instead been made the season's most discussed scandal. By evening, it would be in 3 drawing rooms. By Thursday, 20. Third, the money. Edward's money. Gone with the kiss. She did not allow herself to linger on any of it. There would be time for that later, in private, where falling apart carried no audience. Across the cathedral, she found her mother's face. It was the face of a woman watching a building burn and calculating already what could be salvaged from the wreckage. No tears, no comfort offered, just that silent, devastating arithmetic. Then Valerie. Her sister moved toward her through the frozen congregation, and cheeks wet, hands extended in a gesture that was meant to look like remorse and landed closer to relief. "I'm sorry," she whispered, the words shapeless with crying. "Rebecca, I'm so sorry. We tried to stop. I couldn't." Rebecca looked at her sister and understood something cleanly and completely. Valerie was not sorry for what she had done. She was sorry it had been public. Edward, for his part, spoke to the room rather than to Rebecca. Something about the heart, something about truth. The words arranged themselves into a sentence she recognized from lesser novels, the kind where men's feelings were treated as naturally superior to their obligations. She had known, walking into this cathedral, that she was not loved. She had not known, until this moment, how little that had ever been relevant to anyone's plans, including her own. She reached down, picked up the bouquet, and set it on the altar with the quiet finality of someone returning something that was never truly hers. Then she turned toward the doors. She would walk out alone. She had prepared for most things. She had, it turned out, prepared for this too. Her spine was straight, her chin level, her face performing its finest and most exhausting work. She had taken 3 steps when she became aware of it. Not a sound, not a movement, a stillness, the specific, the weighted stillness of one person in a restless room who was not looking at Edward, not watching Valerie, not whispering to their neighbor. Someone was watching only her. He was standing at the far end of the aisle as though he had always been there. Not beside a pew, not among the guests, precisely in the center of the nave, hands clasped behind his back, entirely still in a room that had forgotten how to be. watching Rebecca with an expression she could not, from this distance, read. The Duke Robert Beaumont. She knew him the way everyone in London knew him, by reputation rather than acquaintance, the way one knows a storm system or a very sharp knife. Brilliant, people said, in the tone they reserved for things they found slightly threatening. Cold, said others, meaning he had declined their dinner invitations and refused to perform the social theatre they required of powerful men. He sat in Parliament and asked questions that made ministers uncomfortable, and he funded projects no one understood until they succeeded. He appeared occasionally at the edges of events he had no obvious reason to attend, and then departed before anyone could ask him why. He had no obvious reason to be here. The Colemans were not his circle. The Rileys were certainly not. He held no particular affection for weddings. Had, in fact, and been quoted in at least one parlour Rebecca was aware of as describing the institution as society's most elegantly disguised commercial transaction. Yet here he stood, and he was looking at her, not with the careful, sliding gaze of someone witnessing a spectacle, but with the direct, steady attention of someone who had come specifically for this moment and was waiting to see what she would do with it. Rebecca kept walking. She was 3 steps from the cathedral doors, and the cold air of the street already a promise in the gap beneath them, when his voice crossed the entire length of St. Bartholomew's and stopped her as completely as a hand on the shoulder. "Miss Riley." The room, which had resumed its urgent murmuring, went silent again. She turned. He had moved, was moving still, walking toward her with the unhurried authority of a man who had never once arrived somewhere and doubted his right to be there. The congregation parted for him the way it always parted for title and consequence, though Rebecca noticed several faces shift from confusion to calculation as they registered what was happening. He stopped 4 feet from her. Up close, the expression she had not been able to read resolved itself into something she had not expected to find in this building, on this morning, on any face directed at hers. Respect. Not sympathy. Not performance. Respect. The quiet, the structural kind that does not require the other person to earn it in the moment because it was never conditional to begin with. "I owe you no pretense," he said, and his voice carried without effort to every corner of the cathedral. She understood immediately that this was deliberate. He wanted witnesses. These witnesses. "So I will be direct." He did not glance at Edward, did not acknowledge Valerie. The room, the scandal, in the wreckage of the last 10 minutes. None of it appeared to factor into his calculation. "What has occurred here today is not a reflection of your worth. It is a reflection of a system that has always assigned women value they cannot spend and blame they did not earn." A pause. Precise. Weighted. "I find that system, as I have always found it, beneath contempt." Someone in the gallery made a sound. He did not acknowledge it. "I am not a romantic man, Miss Riley, and I will not insult your intelligence by pretending otherwise. But I am a man who recognizes injustice clearly, and I am, in this particular moment, in a position to correct one small instance of it." His eyes did not leave hers. "If you are willing, I would ask you to marry me. Here, now, in front of every person who has just decided your story is finished." The cathedral held its breath. Rebecca heard her mother's sharp intake somewhere behind her, and heard Edward begin to protest, a sound she found, surprisingly, very easy to ignore. The Duke of Beaumont stood before her, patient and still, making no move to persuade, to soften, or to fill the silence with anything other than the offer itself. Around her, London waited to write the ending. For the first time in her life, through every negotiation, every arrangement, and every careful performance of a woman who had never once been asked what she actually wanted, the next line of the story belonged entirely to Rebecca. She had seconds. Right here, Rebecca stands at the exact point where 2 lives diverge. One defined by what was done to her, and one built on a single, defiant choice. If you've ever stood at your own version of this altar, passed over, written off, waiting for a story that was supposed to be yours, subscribe now, because Rebecca's answer changes everything. And if you won't, go to the comments and tell me honestly, what would you have done in her place? She said yes, not loudly, not with the trembling relief of a woman rescued. She said it the way she had always done her most important work, quietly, precisely, with full knowledge of what it would cost. I accept. 2 words. The cathedral detonated around them. The murmuring that erupted was not the warm, celebratory kind that fills a room when something beautiful happens. It was the sharp, fractured sound of a social order encountering something it had not been built to process. Fans snapped open, heads inclined toward ears. 3 dowagers in the left gallery appeared to be experiencing the event as a personal affront. The clergyman, to his considerable credit, cleared his throat and opened his book. The second ceremony was nothing like the first. There were no flowers. Rebecca's roses were still scattered on the stone floor where they had fallen. There was no music, no carefully rehearsed processional, no mother adjusting a veil. There was only the clergyman's measured voice, 2 people standing before an altar in the charged, expectant silence of 100 witnesses who had come for a wedding and were now receiving something they would spend the rest of the season trying to categorize. Robert stood beside her with the same stillness she had noticed from across the nave. Present, composed, making no attempt to perform emotion he did not have. He did not take her hand unnecessarily, did not lean close to whisper reassurances. He treated her, she realized, as someone who did not require managing. It was the most novel experience of her adult life. When the clergyman spoke the binding words and looked to her for her response, Rebecca felt something shift beneath her ribs, quiet and tectonic and entirely unexpected. She had stood at this altar once already today, prepared to give the same answer out of duty, out of mathematics, out of the long, careful architecture of self-sacrifice she had built around her family's survival. This time, she answered for no one but herself. It was the first decision she understood in that moment she had ever made in that precise way. Not managed, not negotiated, not offered up like a solution to someone else's problem. Chosen, freely, hers. Across the cathedral, the room continued its recalibration. She caught the edges of it in her peripheral vision. The guests who had turned away from her minutes ago now watching with the helpless attention of people witnessing history rewrite itself in real time. She did not look at Edward. She didn't need to. The silence coming from his direction told her everything. Now, there is a particular humiliation reserved for men who confidently discard something and then watch someone else recognize its value publicly, immediately, in front of the same audience. She hoped he was learning something. And Valerie, golden, adored, always the one the room arranged itself around, stood forgotten at the edge of the congregation, her tears now falling for an entirely different reason, as the attention she had always assumed was her birthright. Quietly, completely, migrated elsewhere. The clergyman closed his book. Rebecca Riley was, for the second time that morning, a bride. This time she had picked up the pen herself. The Beaumont estate was not what she had prepared for. Rebecca had spent the carriage ride constructing reasonable expectations. A cold house, formal arrangements, separate wings and separate lives, cordial at dinner and absent everywhere else. A marriage of convenient ideology rather than actual proximity. She had told herself this was sufficient. More than sufficient. She had, after all, just traded public ruin for private distance, which was, by any objective measure, a considerable improvement. She had miscalculated. The housekeeper who received them at the door was warm without being performative. The rooms she was shown were not the ornate museum-quality spaces she associated with ducal wealth. They were inhabited. Books left open on side tables, the maps pinned to study walls with notes in the margins. The kind of interior that belongs to someone who actually lives inside their own mind. Robert appeared in the doorway of the east wing before she had finished her survey of the entrance hall. "There is something I'd like to show you," he said. No preamble, no enquiry about whether she was tired or overwhelmed or in need of the quiet recovery that polite men offered women they expected to be fragile. He led her to the library. It occupied the entire south side of the second floor. Floor to ceiling, uninterrupted. The kind of room that announces its owner's priorities so plainly that it functions almost as a biography. Rebecca stepped inside and felt, for the first time in a day that had hollowed her out completely, something restore itself. Robert crossed to the desk at the room's center and opened a ledger. "I would like your opinion on something," he said. She looked at him. My opinion. You were trained in household accounts. You understand resource allocation, and you have, I suspect, a clearer sense of what women in reduced circumstances actually require than I am able to develop from the outside." He turned the ledger to face her. "Look at this." She looked. The figures were not estate accounts. They were funding records. Careful, consistent, stretching back 7 years. Columns of disbursements to addresses she did not immediately recognize. Means attached to names she did not know. "What are these?" she asked, though some part of her had already begun to understand. "Schools," he said simply. 12 of them at present, mostly in the northern counties where the infrastructure is worst and the need is highest. Girls who would otherwise receive no formal instruction. He paused. "The funding is managed through a third party to avoid complications." Complications meaning society's disapproval. Meaning society's interference, he corrected. Disapproval I find quite manageable. Rebecca set the ledger down slowly. She thought of the dream she had carried for years like a stone in her pocket. Small, private, something she had never spoken aloud because the world she lived in had no space for a woman who wanted to build something rather than become something. In a school for girls who could not afford tutors. Girls who were bright and invisible and running out of time. She had assumed, walking into this marriage, that dream was the latest casualty of the morning's events. She looked up at her husband. 12 schools, she said. 12, he confirmed. Though the funding model has limitations I have not yet resolved. The sustainability question is solvable, she said. The word arrived before she had consciously decided to speak. If the endowment structure is adjusted and the intake criteria are widened, the model sustains itself within 4 years. Robert was quiet for a moment. Then, with the careful precision of a man who meant exactly what he said, "I was hoping you would see that." They stood on opposite sides of the desk in the lamplight of his extraordinary library. 2 people who had arrived at this marriage by the strangest possible route, and began, without ceremony, to talk. Not about the wedding, not about the scandal, not about what society would say, about the work. It was, Rebecca would later reflect, the most intimate conversation she had ever had. Society, Rebecca discovered, did not attack loudly. It withdrew. The first sign was small. An invitation to Lady Hartwell's autumn dinner that did not arrive when it should have. Then the Pemberton Musicale, which the Beaumonts had attended for 3 consecutive years under the previous Duchess, proceeded without them. And then a morning call from 2 women Rebecca had considered, if not friends, then reliable acquaintances. Cancelled by note, no reason given, the handwriting apologetic, in a way that suggested the decision had not been theirs alone. The message was clear. Clear, coordinated, and delivered with the precision of people who had been practicing social exclusion for generations. The rumors, naturally, followed. She had trapped him, and that was the dominant narrative. The version that traveled fastest because it required the least imagination and redistributed all culpability in the most satisfying direction. Rebecca Riley, disgraced and desperate, had somehow manipulated one of England's most formidable minds into a public proposal he could not, in good conscience, retract. The Duke was to be pitied. She was to be avoided. The scandal was her fault, because scandals involving women always were. Valerie and Edward's marriage, meanwhile, proceeded with considerably less fanfare than either had imagined. Without the drama of forbidden love to sustain it, what remained was two people who had mistaken intensity for compatibility. Rebecca heard this through the same quiet channels that delivered everything else. Third hand, carefully phrased, carrying the specific tone of reports from a war that was not going as planned. She found she felt very little about it, and what she felt considerably more about was the Ashworth Winter Ball. Robert had suggested, with characteristic understatement, that they might decline the invitation. Rebecca had looked at him across the library desk and told him, with equal calm, that she intended to go. He had nodded once, the way he always did when she said something he had been hoping she would say. The Ashworth Ballroom was everything St. Bartholomew's had been, a room full of London's most watchful eyes, were assembled in silk and judgment. The difference was that this time Rebecca arrived as the Duchess of Beaumont, which meant the room could not quite bring itself to turn away. It watched instead, with the hungry attention of an audience waiting for a woman to falter so it could feel comfortable again. She did not falter. She crossed the room, accepted a glass of champagne, and exchanged pleasantries with two earls and a viscount before Lady Compton, the unofficial architect of the winter's whispering campaign, made the mistake of voicing, within Rebecca's earshot, the word manipulative. The room tightened. Rebecca set down her glass. "Lady Compton," she said, her voice pleasant and carrying, "I wonder if you might help me understand something. And a woman is publicly abandoned at the altar through no action of her own. And the word you reach for is manipulative." She paused. "I've been thinking about that instinct for several months now. The one that looks at a woman in her worst moment and assigns her the authorship of it." Another pause. "Shorter. Sharper. It is not an instinct that speaks well of us." The room did not breathe. "The Duke married me because he chose to. I accepted because I chose to. And I would gently suggest that a society which finds two people making deliberate, informed choices more scandalous than public betrayal has mistaken its own discomfort for moral authority." She picked up her glass again. Around her the silence held, and then, from somewhere to her left, came the quiet, decisive sound of a single pair of gloved hands beginning to applaud. It was not many, but it was enough. Rebecca just did what most people spend their entire lives avoiding. She spoke, clearly and without apology, when every force in the room wanted her silent. If you believe that kind of courage deserves to be witnessed, subscribe now. Stories like this one only continue because people choose to show up for them. And if you're still here without subscribing, go to the comments and tell me honestly, what would you have done in her place? The first school opened on a Tuesday in February, without ceremony. Rebecca had considered marking the occasion. A ribbon and a small gathering, something to signal to the world that this mattered. Robert had left the decision entirely to her, which she was still adjusting to. She chose simplicity in the end. The building had been a disused grain merchant's premises in Suffolk, and what it required was not ceremony, but chalk, desks, and a teacher who understood that intelligence was not distributed according to birth. She had found all three. 14 girls arrived on the first morning, in ages ranging from 7 to 15, in varying states of wariness, the particular wariness of children who have been told, repeatedly and by reliable sources, that the world does not have much use for them. Rebecca stood at the front of the room and looked at their faces and thought of every arrangement, every ledger entry, every careful transaction that had been made in the name of necessity over the years, her own included, and felt something in her chest quietly, permanently reorganize. And this, she understood, was what she had been preparing for. Not the altar, not the scandal, this room. Robert's public support arrived the following week in the form of a letter published in the Times. Not an endorsement, not a defense of his wife against society's lingering skepticism, but a clear, reasoned argument for the economic and civic value of educating girls. It was written in the voice of a man who had been thinking about this for years and had simply, finally, chosen his moment. So the effect was immediate and not entirely comfortable for those who had spent the winter treating Rebecca as a cautionary tale. It is difficult to maintain a whispering campaign against a duchess whose school is being discussed approvingly in parliamentary correspondence. Society, with the graceless pragmatism of institutions that have misjudged something, began to reconsider. Valerie came on a Thursday afternoon in March, unannounced. Rebecca received her in the sitting room rather than the library, a distinction that was not accidental. She listened while her sister spoke, and Valerie spoke for a long time, circling and approaching and retreating from the apology at the center of everything. It was more honest than Rebecca had expected, more tired. The golden ease that had always surrounded Valerie was present still, but rubbed thin in places, the way expensive fabric wears at the edges, before it wears through entirely. "I'm sorry," Valerie said finally, simply, without decoration. "I know," Rebecca replied. She meant it. That was the part she had not anticipated. That forgiveness, when it came, would arrive not as a grand gesture, but as a quiet fact. She had processed the wound too thoroughly to perform it anymore. She forgave her sister. She did not, however, return to the shape she had occupied before. The older one, the responsible one, and the woman whose primary function had been to smooth the consequences of everyone else's choices. That architecture was gone. What had replaced it was sturdier and stranger and entirely her own, built not from what others had assigned her, but from what she had, in the most difficult year of her life, chosen to become. Self-worth, she had learned, was not something society granted in a ceremony. It was something you constructed, quietly, like in the wreckage of the morning it tried to take everything from you. 7 years later, Rebecca heard church bells and did not flinch. That was how she knew, more than any other measure, how far she had traveled. She was standing at the window of her study, the one she had claimed in the east wing of the estate, the one with the view across the grounds that Robert had quietly, without announcement, had converted from an ornamental garden into a reading courtyard for the girls who boarded at the Beaumont Academy during term. Below her, in the early morning light, 3 of them sat on the stone benches with their books open, heads bent, entirely absorbed. The particular absorption of people encountering ideas for the first time and discovering, with something approaching fury, how much had been kept from them. She watched them for a long moment. 7 schools now, spread across 4 counties, operating on the endowment model she had worked out at Robert's library desk in the first weeks of their marriage. Over 300 girls enrolled in the current year alone. 17 of the women who had been among her earliest students were now teachers themselves, which was, Rebecca had decided, the only metric that truly mattered. Not the column inches in progressive publications, not the parliamentary citations, not the cautious and belated praise from the same social circles that had withdrawn their invitations in the winter of her disgrace. The students who became teachers. That was the number she kept. The bells continued, somewhere in the village below. She let them come. She thought, as she sometimes allowed herself to do now, without the old damage, with something closer to the scholarly detachment she had always preferred. Of the morning everything began. The ivory gown, her mother's trembling hands, to the bouquet she had held like a shield against a war she had not yet understood, was already in progress. Edward's 2 steps across the altar. She could recall it now with a precision that no longer had any power over her. the way one recalls the exact details of a fever after it has broken. The kiss, the bouquet falling, the sound of 100 people deciding her story was finished. She thought of her own 2 words. They'd spoken into the silence of that cathedral while London held its breath and waited to see if she would disappear quietly, as women in her position were expected to do. I accept. Footsteps behind her. Unhurried. She knew them without turning. Robert stopped beside her at the window and followed her gaze to the courtyard below, where the 3 girls were still reading, oblivious to being witnessed. Then they stood together in comfortable silence. The particular silence of 2 people who have spent years building a shared language and no longer need to speak constantly to be understood. It was not the marriage she had been prepared for. It was not the marriage anyone had designed or arranged or transacted. It had grown slowly and without either of them entirely planning it, till from the desk in the library outward, through arguments and agreements and the quiet accumulation of a life constructed on genuine equality. It was, she had concluded, the only kind of marriage worth having. 14 enrolled for next autumn, she said. The Northwick School will need a second teacher. I saw the figures, Robert replied. I've already written to the endowment trustees. She turned to look at him. He was watching the courtyard. But something in his expression had shifted into the register she recognized, the one that appeared when he was about to say something he had been considering for a while. They thought, you know, he said quietly. Everyone at that cathedral, they thought I saved you. She waited. He turned to meet her eyes, and in his face was everything she had once believed she would never find at an altar. Respect, affection, and the absolute, unperformable recognition of one person by another. Till you change the world, he said. Below them, a girl turned a page. Rebecca looked back at the courtyard, at the bent heads, the open books, the morning light falling without preference across 3 young faces that the world had not yet finished underestimating. She had walked into St. Bartholomew's Cathedral as a transaction. She had walked out as the beginning of something that would outlast the scandal, outlast the season's gossip, but outlast every drawing-room verdict and withdrawn invitation and whispered judgment that had tried to write her ending for her. Her shame had not destroyed her. It had built 14 schools, 300 futures, and 1 life that was, by every measure she now trusted, entirely her own. The bells faded. She let them go. Dear listeners, thank you for staying with us until the end. If this story moved you, please subscribe, like, comment, and share it with someone close to you. Your support inspires us to keep creating stories filled with love, healing, and unforgettable twists.